Committee will come to order. Today I'd like to welcome Comptroller General Gene Dodaro to the committee and thank you. Thank you for your years of service to the American people. The Government Accountability Office is an independent, nonpartisan congressional watchdog charged with examining how taxpayer dollars are spent and evaluating whether government is working efficiently and effectively for the American people. For over 30 years, GAO has reported on high-risk government programs and operations at the start of each Congress. The high-risk list identifies government programs that are vulnerable to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or need reforms to improve them. The high-risk list and GAO's important oversight work have been a vital resource for this committee to identify problems and work on bipartisan legislation to improve the way that the federal government works each and every day. And I hope that we'll continue those efforts in this Congress. Over the past 17 years, by addressing many of the concerns highlighted on the high-risk list, Congress and federal agencies have saved hardworking Americans more than $675 billion taxpayer dollars. And I'm grateful to the GAO for their effective efforts and their efforts to identify those areas for improvement and for their continued commitment to ensuring that government functions in the best interest of all taxpayers. Just within the last 2 years, the federal government has seen an estimated $100 billion in financial benefits due to improvements in high-risk areas noted in GAO's 2021 high-risk report. And 16 out of 34 high-risk areas have made improvements, the most since GAO began its high-risk assessments. For example, a 2016 law that I authored, the Megabyte Act, which was based on a GAO recommendation to improve software license management, has saved taxpayers more than $450 million by reducing duplicative software purchases. I've reintroduced bipartisan legislation this Congress to continue building on that success by improving how the federal government manages software purchases, and will continue working to address other high-risk areas highlighted in GAO's report. This year, GAO has placed our nation's cybersecurity as one of the top 5 high-risk areas that need significant attention, and has issued more than 4,000 recommendations in the cybersecurity domain since 2010. Strengthening our nation's cybersecurity has been a top priority for this committee, and we moved several bills last Congress that I authored to shore up our nation's cybersecurity defenses, including legislation to require critical infrastructure owners and operators to report when they have been attacked and have paid a ransom. This is an important step toward safeguarding some of the most frequent targets of cyber attacks. But it's clear that we must continue working to address this issue as threats from cyber attacks continue to grow. GAO has also highlighted challenges with hiring skilled cybersecurity and artificial intelligence experts to fill roles in federal government. If we are going to be truly effective at strengthening our networks and leading the world in this fast-growing area and protecting our national security, then we must have qualified and dedicated cybersecurity, IT, and AI experts working all across the federal government. I've also authored legislation to address these skills gaps to ensure that we can fill these in-demand roles in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence fields, and will continue working with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to build a strong talent pipeline for the federal government. The latest high-risk list also includes the need to address toxic substances, including PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, that have contaminated communities in Michigan as well as all across our country. These chemicals can be found in food, air, water, and consumer products, adversely affecting the health of millions of Americans. PFAS exposure remains a serious issue, and the EPA must be able to accurately assess and monitor existing and emerging PFAS substances to determine whether they pose a harm to human health. I have pressed for the EPA and other agencies to increase cleanup efforts, and will continue conducting oversight to ensure that agencies are detecting and responding to the threat in a timely manner. And finally, this year's list includes pandemic preparedness and response efforts. Last Congress, I released a report detailing the findings from a 2-year investigation into the federal government's preparedness and initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The investigation revealed serious system failures in our nation's ability to grapple with a pandemic of that scale. And my report made key recommendations to ensure that we are better prepared for the next public health crisis. I'll continue working on legislation to address these shortcomings and strengthen our ability to deal with a future pandemic. Mr. Dodaro, we appreciate you for your independent, nonpartisan work that you and all of the dedicated employees of GAO have conducted and continue to conduct. And I know last month the Partnership for Public Service named GAO the best place to work in the federal government for mid-sized agencies. Congratulations for that. Great, great honor.
Go ahead. Come on. Put your hands together. Jesus.
And I'll add, and I'll add, it was the third year in a row. Now that's worthy of applause. 3 years in a row. 3 years in a row. And so with all of that, I look forward to our discussion here today. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you. This committee is long overdue for a hearing that focuses on the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. We're faced with a $31 trillion mountain of debt. Rather than an attempt to get spending under control, though, both parties continue to propose new spending with no regard for the exploding debt or controlling the already existing spending. To make matters worse, everyone in Congress knows that the plague of waste has infected just about every federal agency. But rather than take steps to restore fiscal health, Congress buries its head in the sand, doles out more and more taxpayer money every year to the executive branch with no strings attached, crosses its fingers, and hopes the problem will fix itself. For years, I've documented outlandish spending in my annual waste report, which exposes how the federal government is misusing Americans' hard-earned tax dollars. My most recent report uncovered $482 billion in government waste. For example, NIH spent more than $1.1 million to get mice drunk. Apparently, we're not aware of what happens when you drink too much. $2.3 million to inject 6-month-old beagle puppies with cocaine. Apparently, there's not enough evidence of what happens to humans on cocaine. $3 million to watch hamsters fight on steroids. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is the kind of stuff. This has been going on since the 1970s. Many of you will remember, the studies to figure out what makes people happy. This stuff's been going on forever. And yet the agency that funds a lot of this, the National Science Foundation, we've doubled their budget in the last 2 years, and we think, oh, well, they'll be much better with waste and fraud with double the amount of money. It's my opinion that the only way you ever rein in waste and fraud is give these agencies less money, and then they'll be forced to make do on less money. Government watchdogs like the GAO were created to expose and combat waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement in the federal government. Every 2 years, GAO publishes its own report that helps call out government misdeeds. The high-risk report is a compilation of government failures and vulnerabilities. It spotlights agencies and programs prone to waste, fraud, and abuse. One issue prominently featured in GAO's most recent high-risk report is the government-wide problem with improper payments. This has been listed in the past and is listed again this year. For example, in 2022, GAO found that Medicare made $46 billion in improper payments. Medicaid made $81 billion in improper payments, which should really not come as a surprise, given that the Medicaid program suspended enforcement of eligibility reviews during the COVID pandemic. This hasn't been talked about much, but during the pandemic, all the so-called rules for looking at abuse just went out the window, and they said, oh, well, everybody deserves Medicaid, everybody deserves food stamps, and nobody came off any of these programs. We just threw out all of the oversight of these programs. And as a consequence, they're in some of the worst state that they've been in a long time. And if this wasn't bad enough, GAO looks at, the substantial levels of fraud in the Department of Labor's unemployment insurance program and says it's almost impossible even to grapple with the problem because it's so big and so opaque. Like my own waste report, GAO also identified Department of Defense as a consistent perpetrator of waste, fraud, and abuse. Since 1995, GAO has identified Department of Defense's financial management as high risk. Unfortunately, not much has changed since then, other than the DoD receiving bigger and bigger checks every year. This is an example of how this is really a bipartisan problem. Republicans wanting unlimited checks for the Defense Department, Democrats wanting unlimited checks for the social welfare. Everything goes up, and the oversight becomes less and less efficient or profound. Until the Department of Defense can properly account for the money it spends, though, Congress can never effectively conduct oversight of the department. The DoD has become a behemoth of spending, and no one here ever questions it. How does all this waste happen? A better question might be, how does all this waste continue to happen and get worse all of the time? When I was a kid in the 1970s, William Proxmire, a conservative Democrat, used to give his Golden Fleece Awards for nonsensical government spending. But here we are decades later, still facing the same problems. There was one study that they did in the last 2 years, I think it was over $1 million, to study if you take selfies of yourself smiling and you look at these selfies later on in the day, whether or not you'll be happier. Well, the thing is you think that's going to get better if we give the National Science Foundation more money? So we doubled their budget, and they do more of this craziness. And every year we point it out, and every year it gets worse because no one is willing to call them on it and say, we're going to give you less money next year unless you're better with spending the money. Mr. Chairman, GAO identified numerous instances of waste, fraud, and abuse that Congress can easily address. I appreciate GAO's work, but what really is needed is congressional will to significantly reduce government waste and spending. The American people deserve an accountable government that manages their hard-earned dollars responsibly. Mr. Dodaro, thank you for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony and working with you to reduce the waste, fraud, and abuse identified in your report.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. Mr. Dodaro, and our subject matter experts, I think, that may be coming. There are a few that might be testifying in the Q&A process. If you would please all rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Today's witness is Comptroller Gene Dodaro. Mr. Dodaro has served as the Comptroller General of the United States Governmental Accountability Office since 2010, following 2 years as the Acting Comptroller General. In his over 45 years of service at the GAO, he has held a number of leadership positions, including Chief Operating Officer and Head of GAO's Accounting and Information Management Division. Mr. Dodaro, welcome to the committee once again. It is always great to see you. We enjoy hearing your testimony and enjoy working with you on these important issues. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Paul, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate all the kind words about GAO. We enjoy working with this committee and other committees across the Congress to make our government more accountable, efficient, and effective. The basic story with this high-risk update is that there's been good progress in certain areas due to congressional and executive branch actions, but there's still serious, very consequential problems that need to be addressed, that need greater attention from the Congress and the executive branch. Now, on the progress side, Mr. Chairman, you pointed out 16 areas improved, 2 to the point that we're removing them from the list. First is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation multi-employer pension program. Congress appropriated funds. That program was slated to be insolvent in 2026. Now the insolvency date's been pushed off to 2051. The single employer program is improved, and so PBGC rates the risk very low of insolvency for either program for the next 15 years. So we're going to take them off the list. Now, just because they come off the list, they're not out of sight. So we'll still continue to monitor what's going on with those programs. We're also removing the 2020 census. They were able to contain for the first time the growth in spending, the cost of the census. They successfully deployed an internet response rate this last time, and they took all our recommendations and that of DHS to bring down cybersecurity risk to the census. So we're taking them off. Again, we'll continue to watch that and whether or not the risk build up toward the 2030 census, and if so, we'll add it back to the list. Now, there's been progress in other areas. Congress provided stable funding, at least for the next 5 years, to the surface transportation area. It didn't solve the problem long term, so it's still on the list, but there was good progress. Congress passed Postal Service Reform Act that eliminated some of the financial pressures on the Postal Service, but the Postal Service business model is still not viable in the future. They continue to lose money, and that remains on the list as well. There were efforts made to pass a number of programs to build in climate resilience up front. So our high-risk area of limiting the federal government's fiscal exposure by better managing and building resilience in up front was addressed. Congress has provided some additional resources to IRS, which deals with our high-risk area of tax administration on that area. So good progress. Congress is to be commended for all the action that they've taken, as well as the executive branch in implementing some of these reforms. Now, we added 3 new areas to the high-risk list. One is HHS's leadership and coordination in responding to public health emergencies. Over the last decade, we've seen the failure after failure to be adequately prepared, and most recently during the pandemic. Roles and responsibilities need to be better clarified, better data, better communication, consistent to and clear to the public. And I fear we're not any better off prepared now for the next emergency than we were for the last one. So I wanted to put on the list to highlight it so that it stays in the public eye and with the Congress and the administration. We also added the unemployment insurance program. Here, we've estimated that at a minimum, there was $60 billion of fraud. We're working on a higher end estimate now, but due to significant fraud and improper payments, which it was occurring even before the pandemic at a much less level, and the need to reform the state systems. I mean, our systems at the state level are very archaic. They're not well postured. The program's not really designed to meet the modern needs of our economy and our workforce recently. Then we just are adding the management of the Bureau of Prisons. There's been problems in staffing, which has led to some concerns about inmate and staff safety, and also their efforts to evaluate programs that are intended to help deal with the recidivism issue haven't been very well evaluated and improved in those areas. Now, with the other areas remaining on the list, I'd like to highlight a few. One is cybersecurity. The federal government's still not operating at a pace commensurate with the evolving great threat. This has been something I've been focused on for many years now. And the national strategy just came out here recently, but there's not yet an implementation plan to be able to implement that strategy, so that they promised to produce one. It needs to be who's responsible for what, how much money do we need, how are we going to measure performance and improvements in those areas. So cybersecurity remains a grave threat to our economy and our national security. It needs to be better addressed. Second is drug misuse. We've added that to a lot high-risk list a few years ago. Latest 12-month statistics show over 107,000 people died from overdoses. There's been problems now not only with fentanyl and opioids, but with xylazine, which is a tranquilizer given to animals, being mixed with the fentanyl, which is causing even more severe problems that we have. So we need a national strategy, needs to be filled out, needs to be implemented successfully. We need more coordination with state and local governments, law enforcement, healthcare providers to deal with this issue. The last area I'll mention is drug oversight of medical products and device safety, which FDA is still not in a good position to deal with potential drug shortages in the economy, and also to have oversight over foreign production of medical products, whether it's pharmaceuticals or medical devices. Most of it, what's consumed in the United States right now, is produced in other countries. and FDA has to have more of an effective strategy for the global supply chain, not just domestic production in the United States. So we're committed to continuing to work on these high-risk areas to make greater progress. They're all very important to public health and safety, our national security, and can save billions of additional dollars. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dodaro. Thank you for the testimony. Federal cybersecurity has been on the high-risk list for years, as you know, but as you just testified to, it remains in need of significant attention. And in many ways, it's becoming a bigger problem that requires even more attention in the past. FISMA, for example, the federal oversight, hasn't been updated in almost a decade, and that was before CISA or the National Cyber Director even existed, and yet we haven't updated some key pieces of legislation. Last Congress, this committee marked up legislation that I wrote related to FISMA, and it passed with unanimous support, but it still hasn't gotten through the House. We're going to continue to work to make that happen, and we're going to continue to work in Congress in a bipartisan way to do that. But my question for you, sir, is you've been sounding the alarm on federal cybersecurity for more than 2 decades now. And as we continue to work on this issue, what do you believe are really the key things that we should be focusing on to make these improvements going forward?
Yeah, there are 4 main areas and about 10 actions that we believe are absolutely critical. One is the development and successful execution of a national and global strategy to deal with this issue. I mentioned the current status of that. Supply chain issues need to be dealt with more effectively. We've done a number of work on those areas. We need a better cyber workforce. There are not enough people in the workforce. They're not always deployed in the federal government and the greatest priorities. And we need to get ahead of emerging technologies. And artificial intelligence and quantum computing will dramatically increase the cybersecurity concerns. I mean, quantum computing could break encryption methods that are currently being used. We need to get prepared for these things ahead of time, which is why I tried to raise this issue. I first put on the list in 1997 to try to get action. Secondly, we have to get the federal agencies to have more comprehensive, effective security programs. Most of the federal agencies are rated by their inspector generals as not having effective IT programs. That's why FISMA reform is needed. We look forward, hopefully that will pass. We also need to have better incident responses when things do happen, and they will happen, that the agencies need to get on it right away, deal with it, limit the damage, and do assessments going forward. The third area, which I believe is one of the most critical, is critical infrastructure protection. I don't think the federal government really knows the preparedness of many of these important sectors of our economy as much as they should in terms of the electricity grid, the communications networks, the financial markets, and many other areas. And so there needs to be much more partnership between the federal government and the private sector in this area if we're going to really have a successful activities, because right now it reminds me of the situation before 9/11 where a lot of people had information but it wasn't being shared with one another. Lastly, privacy laws need to be desperately updated. Privacy Act was passed in 1974. There's been some minor improvements from more recent legislation, but it really doesn't meet the needs of the private sector or well serve the American people.
Well, I want to pick up on critical infrastructure. In your report, you noted that 6 out of the 9 sector risk management agencies need to better measure how critical infrastructure entities are actually addressing the cybersecurity risk, as you alluded to there in your last answer. You've also recommended that CISA establish milestones and timelines to help sector risk management agencies carry out their responsibilities. So my question for you is, sir, is in your view, are sector risk management agencies resourced and organized to handle their responsibilities, or is there something else we should be thinking about?
There needs to be more work to have them better organized and resourced. On the resource side, it's considered in many cases to be a corollary duty to their normal responsibilities, so they're really not dedicated to this effort. There's not a lot of focus on how to make improvements and measure whether or not the efforts that they're taking with the private sector are really improving the profile in those areas. So that both on the organizational level and the resource level, we're not where we should be if we really are serious about managing the threat in this area and trying to work cooperatively with the private sector. I know there's a lot of reluctance to share information between the private sector and the government. We need to overcome that if we're going to, as a nation, have a comprehensive approach. There needs to be some compromise on requirements. I know there's resistance to a lot of regulation, and I'm not advocating that, but we need to get more serious and have some more compromises. And where there is a federal regulatory role, we should use it properly.
Sir Dodaro, the Toxic Substances Control Act provides EPA with the authority to review chemicals already in commerce to keep the public safe, as you're well aware. However, there are thousands of PFAS chemicals still in use that have not yet been fully evaluated by the EPA. In your opinion, what steps does the EPA need to take to ensure that it can efficiently and effectively review PFAS chemicals to keep the American public safe?
Yeah, well, the EPA's come up with a national testing strategy, which is a good first step. They've also established the first proposed rule for regulating PFAS in certain PFASs in drinking water, which I think is a good step forward. But our observation is they're not resourced properly. I mean, they're way behind, and they don't have the type of technical people both in specialty areas as well as the quantity of people necessary to deal with the proliferation of these chemicals throughout our economy. So that's been the biggest area that's been a problem there, and I think Congress needs to focus on that. I'm not, advocating giving them resources without accountability. I mean, they need to have resources, but they need to produce and use those resources effectively.
Thank you. I was happy to see that the 2020 census was removed from GAO's high-risk list, and I appreciate the work that the GAO did to provide key oversight during that process. However, I think we should learn from some of the problems that occurred in the last census, and it's really critical that we do that. And one item in particular was the undercount of many populations, including in the city of Detroit. And we need to address this problem going forward. It has a significant impact on a local area, as you know. And the Bureau must incorporate lessons learned in the 2030 census planning process as it's ramping up. So I just quickly, in the time here, will you commit to continuing the oversight of the Census Bureau? And even though it's off this list, it's still going to require some pretty close oversight.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my earlier assignments at GAO was looking at preparations for the 1990 census. So we've followed every decennial since, and we will continue to do so.
Good. I appreciate that. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you and welcome. I'm very impressed with your work through the years and continue to be amazed at some of it. In fact, you're able to get information that we're not able to get. We have such great resistance from executive branch of either party that everything's hidden from the people's representatives and from the people. Recently, you were commissioned to look at spending through our agencies that has gone to China, and you found that there's $48 million that you can locate so far that went to China. But what was extraordinary, and still is extraordinary, I think has not really fully been recognized, is that you actually discovered that money was going from American universities and being subcontracted to military research in China. So people would be kind of amazed that we're actually funding research in China since we have such an adversarial relationship, but we're actually funding military research. So there's an Academy of Military Medical Sciences, AMMS, and you identified, I think you've publicly identified at least two of the universities with subgrants there, Duke and UC Berkeley. We have people thinking there may be as many as 6 or 7 other universities that are subcontracting this. UC Davis, UTMB, Galveston, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of North Carolina, and University of Minnesota. And we'd appreciate it, I'd like to hear your response if you know any more about it, but also to look into those, because I think there's a question of whether it's being done appropriately, honestly, and actually, frankly, legally. Are you aware of any other universities that you can tell us that are subcontracting grants to China?
Yeah, not offhand. I will, talk to our team, and if we do have something, I'll submit it for the record. Part of the problem is there can be an award to a university, and then there's subawards from the universities to different areas, and it can go on even a little further than that. And it's hard to track the subawards. We're looking at that now. We're also looking at the federal government's coordination of research in international areas. And so we have a separate effort to look at that right now.
In looking at these subcontracts, are you looking at whether or not they're obeying the law as to the rules as to how you're allowed to subcontract it? Do you look at the False Claims Act, or are you looking at legality as well as good policy?
Well, we're looking at how the agencies are structuring the awards and what kind of requirements that they have. I have a little concern that in some of the preliminary briefings that I've heard that we're not striking these agreements in a way that protects the federal government's interest as appropriately as possible. So that
Basically, everything we know, we've learned some from the GAO, and almost everything else we know is from Freedom of Information Act. The agencies will give us nothing. And so recently, we voted unanimously to declassify all of the COVID origins material to give it to us. That doesn't mean they'll give it to us. So we've been asking for declassified information for 2 years, and we get squat. In fact, from Freedom of Information Act, we have two people at DTRA talking to each other, Defense Threat Reduction Agency in the Department of Defense, and they're talking to each other, and they're saying, well, we're reviewing EcoHealth, but it looks like EcoHealth is doing things with the dollars beyond the definition of what they're supposed to be doing. And the lead researcher at DTRA writes back and says, well, we probably should change the wording because if someone ever FOIAs that, that's not going to look good. Can you imagine these people? They also have exchanges going back and forth saying, Senator Paul has requested this, but he's doing it by himself because we can't get a Democrat to help us, and so we're not going to give it to him. They actually are discussing that. So anything you can do, I trust your honesty, your integrity, and that you will try. We need your help because government is so out of control that we can't get information. We complain about the Chinese government. We can't get information from our own government. So we now have unanimously passed thing to declassify things. They're still holding on to all the information. They won't give it up. We're still wrangling. We have not yet gotten one Democrat chairman to sign one letter of request for records. So this is a real problem. And the thing is I don't do this for partisan reasons. My concern is, and there are people, scientists saying this, that the next pandemic that escapes from a lab could kill as much as 5% or even as much as 50% of the people on the planet. This is what we're looking at. We can create monstrous super viruses, and nobody seems to care whether this came from a lab. So I appreciate what you're doing. I'm very interested in the other universities because they do gain-of-function research. They've collaborated with China. But I'm also interested in the military aspect of this. People talk about viruses of having dual use. Well, you can do it to look for vaccines. Everybody wants a vaccine. But it also could be a weapon. So everybody's always talked about dual use in this research, but we typically extensively only worked with other countries in the civilian area. It boggles my mind that nobody seems to know that universities, and y'all discovered this, which is amazing, that our universities are giving the money, subcontracting it to Academy of Military Medical Research, where the scientist there has not the title of doctor, but general and colonel in the People's Liberation Army. So this is something that I can just only encourage you. We will be asking you also to do more of it, and we will be trying to get the other side to agree to help us find out more information. But we would like to encourage this. I would also like to, I'm sure you have a team that has been doing this, if you would allow them to come and visit with us and talk more about what they have, because sometimes we read a conclusion and they might give us better ideas of things that we want to look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was a couple of other, I guess the main thing is to isolate in on what are the rules for these things, whether people are obeying the rules on the subcontracting. And just by not listing it, that can be more than an oversight. That can be actually obscuring where the money is going as well. But I appreciate your work on that, and we would like to get back with you further to talk about if we can talk to your team individually. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm equally concerned about this issue, and we will continue to focus on it. Be happy to work with your staff.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. Senator Carper, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks. This is one of my favorite days of the year. I understand there are one or two people in the room that actually work with you at GAO, and if you work at GAO, most popular place to work in the federal government, raise your hand. Just convey to your colleagues our heartfelt thanks for the great work that you do, and Jane, to you for the extraordinary leadership you provided for a long time. My wife has an interesting sense of humor, and every year when it's my birthday, she's a year or two younger than me, but every year when it's my birthday, she will say to me, "Well, what do you want on your tombstone?" And like, what kind of scripture? Who do you want? What kind of songs do you want to sing at your funeral? And I finally just had enough, and I just said, "On my tombstone, here's what I want." Thinking of all the years that I worked on postal reform legislation, thanks, and with our chairman, and gosh, Rob Portman and Richard Burr and others. But anyway, thinking of great work that we did in passing postal legislation, I said, "Martha, I think I'd like to have on my tombstone, return to sender." Return, and she didn't even blink. She didn't even smile. I thought it was a pretty good line, and she said, "Oh, if that's not available, what else would you like to have on your tombstone?" And I said, "I would like to have, he was death on improper payments to dead people." That'd be pretty good, you know? So we've worked that one, and several of us worked that one pretty hard for a long time. But on a more serious note, I want to pause and address the improper payment, something we've talked about ad nauseum, but we still need to continue to focus on it. But we thank you and your folks for your diligence in working with us there. I also am encouraged by we still have not too many government operations, too much to criticize and find fault with. But you reported to us that we're making improvement in a number of areas, and several key areas have actually been taken off of the high-risk list, and we're happy about that. As we've learned, payments made through the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan EIDL program during the onset of the pandemic resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in improper payments. And while this emergency relief we know helped thousands of small businesses, probably millions across the country, cope with adverse economic conditions, these programs remain susceptible to high levels of improper payments and fraud. In the 116th Congress, I worked with Senator Kennedy, Senator Peters, Senator Paul, and others on this committee to pass legislation that would endeavor to stop making improper payments to dead people and require data sharing among federal agencies to ensure that these payments are reduced and eventually eliminated. Question. Comptroller General, what suggestions does GAO have for additional legislative improvements to further address improper payments and fraud?
Yes. First, I recommended legislation that for any new federal program that's created or a major increase in a program of $100 million or more be automatically designated susceptible to improper payments. Right now, it can be 1 or 2 years after the program is started before the very first improper payment estimate is made. That's too late. Particularly in some of these emergency programs, the program's over before the estimates are made. And the later you make these estimates, the less likely you are to recover the improper payment. Secondly, agencies should be required to have special procedures in place and internal controls before emergency spending or major increases in spending. Right now, we've made that recommendation to OMB. Everybody in the executive branch thinks the normal controls are enough. We don't.
Okay.
We think they need to have special controls, and they know what they need to do, because this is where the push is to get the money out fast without having the normal controls in place. So you need some kind of tailored controls, and you can do both. You can protect the government and get the money out fast if you plan ahead and use those experiences. The last thing I'd mention is that there needs to be a permanent analytical capability within the Inspector General community. We had it during the Recovery Act days. It was eliminated in 2015. I recommend that Congress make it permanent. That didn't happen. I'm at it again. I'd like to see it made permanent. The IG community is supportive. They can help prevent fraud and improper payments.
Right. Well, my staff and my colleagues have heard me say over and over and over again, everything I do, I think everything we do, we can do better. And you've given us three good ideas to how to do an even better job on improper payments, especially to people who are no longer with us. Second area I wanted to pursue in my questions is deals with establishing a government-wide cyber workforce plan. And as folks in this committee know well, the cyber threat posed by hostile nations and groups around the world cannot be overstated. We continue to see cyber threat actors evolve and advance their techniques in ways that pose a threat to business, healthcare facilities, critical infrastructure, and put at risk the financial and personal safety of our countrymen and women. Unfortunately, the cyber threat landscape is not getting less volatile, it's actually getting more volatile. And Comptroller General, in your statement, I believe you mentioned that further action is needed in cyberspace when it comes to establishing and effectively implementing a government-wide cyber workforce plan, a government-wide cyber workforce plan. My question along those lines is, given that each federal agency's mission and size is so different from one another, how best can we establish a government-wide cyber workforce plan that would address the needs of each department in an appropriate way?
Yes. I'm going to ask Nick Morenos, who's our expert in the IT and cyber area, to respond, Senator.
Yes, Senator, first, just to point out, too, we have heard from the White House that there are intentions to establish that national strategy for cyber workforce in the summer. What we'd be looking for is, one, a push back to the agencies to continue to identify where they have gaps. Even though we've seen some improvement in this area, there's no comprehensive way for us to know whether each federal agency actually knows what it needs, first of all. The second thing is that each agency then needs to focus on not only recruiting and hiring, but also retaining really highly qualified staff. We know there's a shortage not only within the federal government, but across the nation. And so it'll be important for them to leverage not only the tools that they have right now, but recent legislation that's called on creative ways to try to generate ideas for how to keep federal government employees actually staying within the federal government.
Great.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd add on. One is that there's a problem now between competition among agencies for the same talent. So I think a government-wide plan can help deal with that issue a bit, because there's an unlevel playing field. Some agencies have special hiring authorities and pay, others don't. And I think there needs to be a look at that and whether that's rationalized properly. The other thing is that OPM, we've just issued a report recently saying the Office of Personnel Management does not have its own plan for improving its workforce and needs to. So the human resource people in the government, whether they're centralized in OPM or in individual agencies, aren't what we need in order to help support the recruitment and hiring and of cyber people. And I think this is also a cautionary tale that we need to get ahead in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, because there were really no qualification standards for cyber people for a number of years. And so we were way behind the curve.
Mr. Chairman, we have a saying in the Navy when people do extraordinary work, we use the phrase, bravo Zulu. And I would just say to you, to both of you, to the folks that are behind you from GAO, and those that are maybe listening in or watching and tuning in today, and those who are just hard at work, bravo Zulu, keep up the great job. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Gene, it's good to see you again. Let me start with the same question we talk about every year. And we start, you'll know the rest of this question when I started. Taxpayers' right to know. What we've talked about year after year. It's obviously passed. $20 million was given to OMB to go through the implementation. They've received that funding. They've said they're doing pilot programs. They've also said they're coordinating with you on the process. Tell me how it's going for taxpayers' right to know. They have the funding. They have the law. What's actually happening?
Yeah. Their current plan right now is to create an interagency working group to leverage additional resources needed and to get buy-in from the agencies, because they're going to need to have to do that. And they're going to deploy resources this summer and make a major push to try to begin developing an inventory and having the pilot. So I'm encouraged by that. It's taken them a while to get to this point, so it may put them at a disadvantage in meeting the 2025 date that's been
Go
established.
ahead and try
for this.
anyway. Is your team at
Yeah.
the table in the conversations
Yeah,
on setting the list, setting the priorities, setting the program? Because the program definitions is a big part of this, and we've got to get that right at the beginning.
Yeah, we've been playing an appropriate role in protecting our independence, but for being a sounding board and making suggestions to them. So they're listening, and they're adopting some of our suggestions. We were the ones that were kind of encouraged them to bring the agencies in, not only from resources, but to get
Get the
buy-in.
conversation going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Strategic human capital management's been on your list since 2001. It remains on the list. This is an issue that I talk about a lot. Our committee's talked about a lot. Best I can tell, there's about 105 hiring authorities. When I asked the Chicos about it, about 20 of them are used more than 90% of the time. But every time I bring up direct hiring authority, everyone has a conniption on it and thinks that that'll never work or whatever it may be, except for the entities that actually use it. What is it going to take on the strategic human capital in trying to be able to figure out on the hiring side, just the hiring portion of it, to be able to simplify this so it's actually usable and it doesn't take 145 days to hire someone at the IRS?
Yeah. Well, one of the government-wide shortages and critical skill gaps is in the human resource people who actually support and run the hiring efforts and activities. And, there's problems at OPM itself and Office of Personnel Management, and there's problems in individual agencies. And so a lot of the human resource people who are trained over the years, going back to the civil service reform days, to be compliance-oriented, to make sure you don't do anything wrong in these areas, as opposed to what can I do to be helpful to help in these difficult areas. So we need to change that mindset, change that approach, and get the right people in there to support them. Then I think things will be a lot easier.
You and I have talked several times about the census, and no census has dropped off the list this year. But one of the issues that I bring up consistently is the IRS every single year touches every single person basically across the country, or a vast majority of them on it. Census does it every 10 years, but for whatever reason, Census and IRS won't talk to each other. There is some information sharing behind the scenes, but why couldn't the Census every 10 years partner with the IRS, what they do every 1 year, and add a couple of additional questions to your IRS filing, and that also fulfills your census as well for that year, and then for everyone else that doesn't do a filing to be able to then go pursue those folks. Yeah. That seems too common sense to actually work in the federal government, but I've been told for 10 years, won't work. Yeah. I've also asked why won't it work, and no one can give me the answer why it won't.
Yeah. Well, the only limitation I could see offhand why it wouldn't work is the timing of it. The census is where everybody is on one particular day, when they do the measurement, and the IRS filings are a year later. You file 1 year for the previous year.
Right.
So there may be a timing issue there, but I'll look at it. I'll have our team look at it.
Yeah,
there may be ways to overcome that.
Correct.
But to me, that the timing would be the major
Census
issue.
obviously goes door to door trying to be able to check on people, so it's not, they get as close as they can to one day. That one
Right.
day could be April 15th.
Right.
That would be just a statutory thing for us to be able to say April 15th is the one date, and so we could work
Right,
through that process.
but when you'd have to make it, I'll think about it, but when you file on April 15th, you're filing for the previous calendar
But you are
year.
filing where you are this year with your address where you are this year on it as well. So let's
Yeah.
talk about that at length on
Okay,
it,
all right.
to be able to go from there. There's a couple things I actually want to bring up. It's GAO. Can I do that? Do GAO oversight on it. You have been in telework status for 3 years now. You're in the process of coming back in telework status. I look at your numbers typically in the past. You're typically $145 to 1 of recovery. Well done, spike the football. But now in telework status, you're at about $72 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because of telework status, or is that something else?
No, that's something else. I mean, we've been in telework status actually for a decade. I mean, we've had maximum, not maximum, but we've had expanded telework. We've studied it. It has had no impact on our quality and productivity of our work. There were two factors that led to the 145. In 1 year, we had an all-time record, about $200 billion of savings.
Good year.
And normally it's more in the $70 billion, kind of $50-70 billion range. And then secondly, during the pandemic, we had to spend a lot of time looking at the $4.6 trillion in pandemic spending, and so that took us kind of off our normal path, but we're in pretty good shape, and I think we'll continue to produce a great return on
We
investment.
do need to talk about telework because I'm an advocate for remote work.
Right.
And I think that's a possibility, but one of the things I always want to ask is if you're doing remote work or telework and you're actually somewhere else, but you're getting paid at a higher rate as if you're in Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or somewhere else, there's some real inconsistencies there. But I think there's some real opportunities. I call the time of COVID the world's largest pilot program for telework. And there's some real opportunities I think we can do, especially for spouses of military and others in the days ahead.
Absolutely, and actually, we're in the process of negotiating a remote work option with our union right now. And the issue around pay is the most appropriate thing. And I want to make sure it's equitable, but not out of line.
Yeah, it is an appropriate conversation to be able to have based on where people live and work. GAO, my understanding, has also put out a new style guide for language in it. And I want to just bring this up. We can have a longer conversation on this as well. But the style guide is trying to be more inclusive in the language. I prefer to use the term respectful in language rather than inclusive, and let me give you a reason why. In the style guide, it tells folks at GAO when using terminology like male and female that's an agency uses or that's written in a law, GAO should state the source to not give the impression that GAO endorses male and female. I'm not sure that's a good idea because we're back to if we're going to be not offensive, we need to not be offensive to everybody in it. And there are several other things, taking out terms like man-made or manpower or unmanned or not using the term policeman. Not talking about a person whose gender identity doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth implies a much larger, not only political issue, but a societal issue as well, to be able to take some of these things. So there's several things in the style guide that I look at and I say, hey, I really need GAO to stay out of cultural battles and to definitely not say if Congress writes a law that says male and female, GAO should basically apologize for it and say, hey, their word, not ours. There's some concerns that are in this. And so love to be able to have a conversation about how we can keep GAO consistent with where we are both in law and not trying to compete with Congress and trying to apologize that Congress inerrantly uses the word male and female. So this will be a bigger issue. We can talk about it at a different time as well, but we need GAO to stay GAO. Can I just say that?
I understand your point and be happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, I don't mind respectful language. That's a good thing to honor all people in the process, but thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters, and thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for being here today for all the work that you've been doing. And I want to focus a little bit on government legacy IT. Once again, this year's high-risk report, it notes that the federal government efforts to improve the management of IT acquisitions and operations is a work in process. We know technology is moving quickly. But while your report gives credit to OMB for pushing agencies to implement IT reforms, it also states that all 5 ratings for this particular goal remain unchanged since 2017. Specifically, you cite 20 recommendations that have still not been addressed at 14 agencies, including the development of modernization plans for legacy IT systems. As someone who began my career in computer programming, writing code in COBOL, Fortran, Assembler, and others, it does trouble me that so many of our federal agencies continue to use that legacy technology that in some cases has been around since the 1980s, and it's based on coding language that virtually no one works in anymore. This poses serious challenges when the technology breaks or malfunctions. Maintenance is a huge part of what you do, upgrade and maintenance. You can only patch it so many times. I know this from personal experience. I'm concerned the federal government's still getting it incomplete on this report card. So, can you talk to me about the importance of getting our IT systems modernized, streamlined, forward-facing, and nimble in our ability to do all the things that we have to do? And why are people still only partially meeting their goals?
Yeah, this has been a vexing problem. We've been trying to push people on for a number of years. The problems include poor security. A lot of these systems weren't built with security, and so it's complicating our ability to, in cybersecurity area. The cost is expensive. There are efforts to try to replace them. but they often fail because of lack of disciplined IT management issues going forward. We've recommended, one of the things is they're not forced to get off of the systems and commit to a date. And we recommended that OMB do that, and they haven't implemented that recommendation. So I think, Congress needs to step in here and try to require fixed dates, because they just keep rolling these systems forward. It doesn't do good for taxpayer customer service issues as well.
Well, I'll tell you, none of it in the old code, cybersecurity. There were single mainframe, there was just one point of entry. The world has changed now, and it does leave us vulnerable. So I want to move on now to our cybersecurity strategy overall, because since 1997, GAO has designated information security, of course, it's high risk. We know it. Everyone knows that. And this year's high-risk report calls for the administration to fully establish and implement a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy and the implementation plans. Maybe we should put those hard dates in there. And last month, the administration released the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So as the administrator, as you execute, or as the administration, executes the National Cybersecurity Strategy, what should be the roles and responsibilities of the individual federal agencies to this national strategy that, frankly, if we don't do, all of us, in every single way, are vulnerable?
Yeah, this is a critical area. They've committed to try to clarify the roles and responsibilities. I'll ask Nick Marinos to elaborate a little bit.
Yes, Senator, you raise a really important point, and one that we would expect to see within an implementation plan, which is ultimately outlining not only timeframes, outcomes that you want to have in mind, but also who's going to ultimately be responsible for working together and then being accountable for actually taking action on it.
Could you talk about duplicative programs? Because maybe we can share front ends. We can populate data between agencies that everyone doesn't have to develop every single thing. Maybe you could address that as well.
Absolutely. The legislation that Congress has recently passed, not only to enact and create CISA, but also to empower CISA to be one of the key coordinating bodies, especially across the federal agencies when it comes to their own cybersecurity, is an area that you would want to see within an implementation plan. And likewise, with the creation of the Office of the National Cyber Director, a great heading in the right direction. We'd want to see, what role does the National Cyber Director actually play in holding agencies accountable for taking these actions?
Thank you. I'm going to keep on this because I think it's so important. It's something on the top of everybody's mind, whether it's personal, professional, or for the world. We see a lot going on, and we need people to do this work. We need programmers, we need engineers, we need cybersecurity, just every kind of analyst that's involved all along the chain. So we have a huge workforce shortage, and this is not just a challenge in this area, but in others. And the report does state, and I'm going to quote here, federal agencies need to take additional actions to address the federal cybersecurity workforce shortage. And so I'm going to build on Senator Carper. I was going to point to him. He's not here. But what practices, and either one of you can answer, should the federal agencies adopt to solve the cybersecurity workforce shortages? I have a lot of opinions. But what measures, what should we be putting in place to address this? Apprenticeships, certificates, 2-year, 4-year, all of the above. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, Senator, I think the important thing is to be creative here. And we realize that if the federal government is not the only game in town when it comes to cybersecurity employment, it needs to be positioned in a way that's going to have a lot of flexibility. So as mentioned earlier, we have seen hiring authorities, flexible hiring authorities, as one way for federal agencies to take advantage of it. But in order to do so, the human resource employees need to be aware and cognizant of how to leverage those flexibilities. Likewise, the potential to use things like rotational workforce or potentially even...
What about a reserve workforce? I have some bills out there to create a cyber reserve workforce to surge up.
It's a really viable option, and I know your interests are in particular in DoD and DHS, two places that obviously we need to see a very strong and well-capacitated cyber workforce. So I think all options should be on the table, because ultimately the federal government is going to be a competitor with its private sector partners and has to operate off of different measures.
If we can include them to surge up, that's a positive thing. So thank you. I think Senator
On behalf
Blumenthal.
of,
Thank
on
you.
behalf of Chairman Peters, I recognize Senator Hassan.
Well, thanks, Senator Blumenthal, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member, and I want to thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for your service and for being here, and for all the folks from the GAO who are here this morning and do this work. Thank you for your work. I want to start with a question and really drilling down on technology issues. You're hearing about it all around the dais this morning. In 2023, the federal government is expected to spend more than $100 billion on new and existing technology. GAO's high-risk list makes two recommendations to help lower costs and better manage technology purchases all across the government. First, GAO recommends that Congress consider giving the Federal Chief Information Officer greater responsibility to address longstanding technology challenges. How could expanding the role of the federal CIO help curb excessive federal spending on technology, and what specific authority do you believe the federal CIO still needs?
I'm going to ask Nick to respond to this, Senator, but first, in historical perspective, I worked with the Congress, and this committee actually, back in 1996 to create the Clinger-Cohen Act, to create chief information officers in the government. They were intended to have much greater responsibilities than what it's played out over the years. Congress attempted to change this in 2014 with the Federal Information Technology Reform Act, but still the CIOs do not have all the authorities. Nick can give the details on what they need.
Thank you.
Yeah, Senator, two quick thoughts. First, with respect to the federal CIO's own position, the reality is that the federal government represents probably the biggest buyer of technology within the nation. And so it's important for us to have a way to know that that IT's money is being spent effectively. And so having a strong federal CIO presence would allow that individual to bring federal agencies to the table, CIOs and leaders of agencies, to know not only are they spending money wisely, but if there's opportunities to leverage that buying power, that we're seeing shared services be leveraged. And then the other side of it is ultimately to hold CIOs accountable and federal agency heads accountable towards those CIOs as well. We continue to see federal agencies improve in aligning the CIO with agency leadership so that they can actually have the ability to see across a federal agency whether IT dollars are being spent. It's a lot of money and really does require a stronger oversight.
Well, thank you for that. And you just referenced quickly the importance of collaboration between the CIOs and their agency leadership, but can you talk a little bit more about why that collaboration is so important for reducing IT costs and ensuring that agencies have the technology they need to serve the American people?
Certainly. So we have seen on the GSA side, General Services Administration has established a lot of functions that allow agencies to leverage shared services, which is one way to bring the cost down. But in order to encourage agencies to actually leverage those available services, a federal CIO could bring CIOs to the table and ensure that we are ultimately using our buying power effectively.
Thank you.
I think the other issue, Senator, in that case is that a lot of the program managers that actually run the programs have their own ideas on what they think they need in technology-wise, and sometimes it's not the most efficient approach. So you need a technical person to partner with the program people, but they need to be supported by the agency head. So that communication needs to be there in order to make the right decisions.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit more about the National Cybersecurity Strategy while we are at it. For 25 years, the high-risk list has highlighted the importance of cybersecurity as a matter of national security, affecting not only government, but individual schools and businesses, and you've talked about that. As you mentioned, last month, the Biden administration released the first ever national cybersecurity strategy, something that GAO has supported for years. What should be the federal government's next step towards executing the national cybersecurity strategy?
Ultimately, an implementation plan, Senator. There are a lot of to-dos in that strategy, and we commend the administration for pursuing it. We've seen it align quite closely to many of the actions that we've been calling for over the years. But the rubber will meet the road ultimately with implementation of those strategic goals. And you mentioned, for example, the issues that we see, for example, in K through 12 schools and the ransomware attacks that we see are only going to be assisted by federal government agencies if we have better coordination. We would want to see the implementation plan reflect that coordination as well.
And I will also urge them to look at collaborating with the Center on Internet Security more effectively, because I think they're doing some pretty good work, too. Mr. Dodaro, I want to move to a different topic, and thank you for highlighting the substance misuse crisis in your testimony. In 2022, New Hampshire had the highest death toll from drug overdoses since 2017, and as of today, in 2023, 55 people in my small state have died from drug overdoses. Sadly, these numbers reflect a national trend. GAO found that expanded access to medication-assisted treatment is critical to getting more people into recovery. I'm proud that my bipartisan bill with Senator Murkowski was recently signed into law to expand the number of providers who are able to prescribe this life-saving treatment. The high-risk list, however, points out that the Office of National Drug Control Policy's 2022 National Drug Control Strategy did not identify resources needed to expand the availability of medication-assisted treatment so that more people can get it. Why is it important to identify financial, personnel, or other resources needed to expand access to medication-assisted treatment?
Actually, that's a very important issue. We've looked at it in terms of both how Medicaid funds can be used for that, as well as having additional supporting assistance. But part of the problem we've had with the strategy is it doesn't allocate resources appropriately so we could measure the impact in that area. But it's very important. I'll ask Jess Farb, who's the director of our healthcare area, to address that more specifically.
Senator, I think in terms of what's expected in the Office of National Drug Control Strategy, we are looking to see metrics and goals that will measure the spending that you're talking about to make sure that there is the correct amount of funds available to support this. It's definitely a tool that's very important for recovery from drug misuse, and I wanted to also bring in my colleague Charles Johnson as well, who is my partner in this.
Thank you.
Senator, also, one of the things we did see absent from the strategy was they have goals set up, but they don't have the budget allocations over a 5-year period. And what we've heard from the ONDCP is that they don't disclose the president's budget over a 5-year period. But we'll continue to look into this and to work with them to see if we can get them to think about that, as well as engaging with some of the key partners, other agencies involved, as well as state and locals.
Well, thank you. I mean, one of our challenges now that we are allowing much more access to medication-assisted treatment is to figure out how to make sure that it is truly accessible and that pharmacies are participating as well. So I look forward to working with you on that. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman Peters, I recognize Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Comptroller Dodaro, I think you guys do it. You and your team do an unbelievable job. I think you are a great federal resource, and I've been up here 4 years, and you've been unbelievably helpful in reviewing how government works. So I just want to thank you and your entire team for what you do. The first question is, how important is it that the federal government have independent inspector generals?
I think it's absolutely essential.
And what would be some of the reasons why a federal agency should have one, an independent inspector general?
Well, there's two reasons. One is that they need to have an investigative function in there. So many of them have criminal investigators and other things that can look at misconduct with regard to the federal employees in that area, or contractors, or other areas. And that each agency, some of these agencies are so large that you need to have an independent audit function as well to be able to provide information. Now, they're structured so that they report not only to the agency head, but also to the Congress. And that was the way that they were set up. And by and large, it's worked, effectively over the years. And we're, at GAO, I mean, can't cover the entire federal government with the resources that Congress has given us. So we leverage the IGs to make sure we don't duplicate what they do. They arrange, for example, the annual financial audit of the agency's financial statements. We review the work. It's usually done by an IPA, and then we can use that to rely on to make our report on the government-wide financial statements.
So the Federal Reserve has nearly a $9 trillion balance sheet. I don't think there's any federal agency that has probably a $9 trillion balance sheet other than the Federal Reserve. And they don't have an independent inspector general. So do you think it would be appropriate for them to be like, what is it, over 30 federal agencies have independent inspector generals? Would that make sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense. When I first became acting Comptroller General, I actually came to the Congress and asked for a statutory inspector general at GAO. So we have one there, and I think it's important that the statutory IGs have certain protections and notification requirements, et cetera, and I think so. There is one agency that has a balance sheet higher than that. Unfortunately, it's the Bureau of Public Debt. So, but in any event, that's just a side issue.
So you've written a lot about this, but I watched when I was governor of Florida, we had the hurricanes, and I watched how much fraud and abuse there was with regard to a variety of things that FEMA would contract for, or the Corps of Engineers. And one of the biggest is debris cleanup. And it's frustrating because you just see this significant amount of waste. And so I've had a bill that would require, as an example, any entity that's going to, do debris is going to pay for it, like counties and cities have a landfall contract and then enforce it. And then we have way more review because, as you know, as I think you all have written, FEMA cut back on even a lot of their review of when they pay. So do you think we ought to have, it's a lot of money. I think with Irma, it was over $1 billion just a debris cleanup. So do you think they ought to have some way to stop all this fraud?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, debris removal is not only expensive, but it's the critical path to recovery. It's the first thing that needs to be done. And I think because of that, there's a lot of people who take advantage of that situation because of the urgency and the dilemma facing people. And that whenever we've seen emergencies, you saw that with the pandemic, it brings out best in human nature, but it brings out a lot of the fraudsters in that area, in those areas, and disaster relief is no exception to that. And so I think the bill that you and Senator Peters are working on is a good step forward to help focus on that issue and put more attention on it, as was the Advanced Contracting Act that this committee passed in 2020. But the proposed legislation builds further on that.
Another issue that came up while I was governor is national flood insurance. We've been a 3+ donor state since national flood insurance came in. And what I watched while I was governor is there's an unbelievable increase in certain areas of rates. And so you'd think if you were a donor state of any amount, but especially triple donor state, you wouldn't think you would see that. How important is it for FEMA and the federal government to do everything they can to help build a private flood insurance program to reduce the risk of the national flood insurance program?
I think it's very important that program be reformed. It's been on our high-risk list as a separate program since 2006 or 7, following Katrina and Rita. Right now, there's over $20 billion debt that the program owes to Treasury, and that's after the federal government has forgiven $16 billion in debt that was owed before. It's not actuarially sound, and as a result, you have a lot of inequities in the program that's hard to keep up to date. So trying to have a private market for it, the question is whether or not that can be structured in a way that would be attractive to insurers, because they're going to charge actuarially sound rates or they're not going to insure. And so the federal government could provide more affordability assistance to help people with the rates as opposed to running the program itself. And so I think that should be given serious consideration.
Thank you. Thanks. First off, I just will tell you, what the reports you guys put out are unbelievable. You guys do an unbelievable job. Your whole team does. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Scott. I have a few questions, and then we may reach a conclusion. I want to come back to an area that Senator Carper asked about on the SBA. And I want to drill down a little bit on PPP and EIDL. I think the SBA did vital work in dispensing $1.1 trillion very expeditiously, as was required by the times. And we all, I think, realized that there was also a good deal of waste and possibly even fraud. In your view, is there still a need to look into and dig down deeper into the way those programs were performed, both to hold accountable the companies that may have received benefits illegally, and also to learn some lessons more broadly about these kinds of programs in the future? And as much as we may appreciate what SBA did, there are also a lot of companies, small and medium-sized businesses, that were denied these benefits because the program ran out of money.
Right.
So it performed a vital function, making money available, saving businesses, but at the same time, it became a target for waste and fraud, and thereby denied some of the worthwhile businesses what they needed and deserved. So on those two programs, is there work still to be done?
Absolutely. I think your articulation of the circumstances and happened is exactly precisely the way I've seen it unfold. And we're working with SBA to try to have them build in a better fraud risk framework in the first place. We actually worked with the Congress back in 2016 to pass the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act, which required agencies to implement GAO's best practices for how to prevent fraud in the first place. SBA was slow to implement that, and therefore it was not in place before the pandemic hit when it should have been. So they weren't well positioned to take on the additional spending during that period of time. The first fraud risk assessment that they did was after the program was over. And that's not as helpful, obviously. So they need to have a better program in place. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program is an ongoing program activity too, going forward. So even though they built a special component on it, it's there. And then there's the normal disaster loan program that SBA has in place going forward. So we're working with them to try to get them to be better prepared. I think another lesson learned is to not allow self-certifications. That was a problem in there. That invited fraud in a number of areas. So there are key lessons learned by digging deeper into the programs, and I've made some additional recommendations to the Congress as well about focusing more on making sure agencies can focus and prevent fraud in the first place, because we don't recover that much as a percent of the funds after it happens.
There's a lot of money still to be recovered.
Yeah, there
Is that
could
what you're
be.
saying?
There could be. Now, Congress for those two programs has passed an extension of the statute of limitations so that the Inspector Generals can go further and the Department of Justice into criminal prosecutions, and I think that's fine. The administration's also recommended doing that in the unemployment insurance area, and I think that would be a good area as well.
In your view, from what you've seen, was there an awareness at the time that these loans, later becoming grants, going out, were going to the wrong people?
I tried to raise awareness that we needed to do a better job checking about that, okay? But SBA wasn't in the mindset of hearing that initially in the program. And to their point, there was enormous pressure to get the money out quickly during that period of time. And I understood that, but I went in, I offered, talked to the SBA administrator at the time to help them design things. We did that, if you recall, during the global financial crisis when the Troubled Asset Review Program was set up. I worked with Secretary Paulson and his team. We helped give advice on building internal controls in up front. And that program, while it wasn't popular, was effective, and you had nowhere near the amount of fraud that you have in these programs. But the SBA in the original days of the creation of that program was, we're too busy to focus on that. We got to get this money out. And so I think, there were people that had concerns, us and the Inspector General, but we weren't able to persuade them to listen.
But they could have listened. In other words, you can be busy getting money out and at the same time impose some safeguards. And I will tell you, just anecdotally, I heard during this time, because I was going to bat for small businesses who needed money, and what I heard was, well, we've run out of money.
Yeah.
And the small businesses would come to me and say, we've heard X, Y, and Z company got millions of dollars. They don't fit the criteria. What's going on here?
Yeah.
Can't you do something about it? They were coming down
Right.
rightfully on their elected representatives. So if we were aware of it, wasn't SBA, and couldn't they have done something?
Yeah, they could have, but didn't.
I would like to follow up with you on this issue because I think that the lessons you're learning should be more widely known throughout government. And I also, this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it. Of the 1.1 trillion, do you have kind of a ballpark number on how much was misdirected? And I'm using misdirected purposefully because I don't want to say waste, I don't want to say fraud, but just went to the wrong hands.
Yeah. I don't have that number for SBA and the PPP program. In the unemployment insurance area, we've estimated that there was at least $60 billion at the low end was fraudulent. We're working on a higher end estimate now. They had a already existing methodology for estimating fraud in the regular uninsurance program ahead of time, so we've been able to use that as a basis to make an estimate. You really didn't have that in the SBA programs. We have information on the number of investigations and prosecutions and the amount of recoveries. We're happy to share with you and your team. I'm happy to talk about this. We're making more headway now with the current administration on this area, and so they're taking that seriously. But for 3 straight years now, the financial auditor of SBA's financial statements has been unable to give an opinion on their financial statements because of these problems. So there's a significant amount of issues here. That's why I've kept them on the high-risk list until they get resolved going forward. But there are definitely lessons to be learned that could be more broadly applied and hopefully used in the future. What happens, I've been in June, I've been in GAO 50 years, all right? So what I've seen over the years is the lessons fade in terms of when the next crisis comes, and then the whole thing gets overcome by events and the people to doing this. Also, there has been an estimate at SBA for the PPP program that there was $36 billion in improper payments that were made. Now, it doesn't mean they were fraudulent, but that tells you some level of magnitude of
Some impropriety.
Yeah.
And let me ask you, I am assuming, as a former prosecutor, I was the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut for 4.5 years, and then I was State Attorney General for about 20 years. But I'm assuming that there's still a lot of work to be done in recovering that money. Am I correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And there's a Pandemic Response Accountability Committee made up of the Inspector Generals that's led by Michael Horowitz is the chair, who's the Inspector General of the Justice Department. They're focused on this. There's investigations ongoing both at Labor and at the Small Business Administration, in addition to the IG community. That's why they've asked for the extensions on statute of limitations.
Statute of limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're working hard at it.
I would like to follow up with you, and I will be contacting Mr. Horowitz as well, as not only a member of this committee, but also as the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation.
Right.
I don't know whether Senator Ossoff wants to ask his questions now.
I'm
I
flexible.
have a few more questions on a different topic, if I may.
Sure. I've not yet voted. Have you, Senator Blumenthal? Okay, then go right ahead. We'll be stragglers together.
Great. Food safety, another area that is close to your heart, I know, close to mine as well. I have been a strong advocate of a separate food safety agency. Right now, as you well know, the authority is fractured in 15 different agencies. There are 30 different federal laws. And as a result, nobody is really doing enough and doing it quickly enough. And I think you're well aware of what happened with the infant formula contamination. But it is just one example of how the present system is failing. Do you favor establishing a dedicated food safety agency?
That's obviously a policy issue for the Congress. I think it's worthy of examination and issues. It's been on the high-risk list for a number of years. We initially, when we put it on the list, were pushing for a single food safety issue, but we were getting like no traction, so we went with the next best thing, which was a government-wide plan with performance measures in there, and a permanent working group on food safety issues, which was in place years ago but had been abandoned. So there wasn't a formal coordination mechanism, there wasn't a government-wide plan, so we decided, and that's what our current recommendations are. And what we said is if that doesn't happen, Congress should look at a reorganization and creating a blue ribbon commission to look at that. But certainly that's one option that I think is worthy of consideration, particularly on how stretched FDA is with their responsibilities in the drug area. The food thing is a lot on their plate.
They have a lot on their plate, and we may not have success this session with the Food Safety Administration Act introduced last Congress by my colleague in the House, Representative DeLauro, and here in the Senate by Senator Durbin. I co-sponsored it, and I've been a strong advocate of it. The FDA could do more, and it has a lot of different responsibilities, but I think the nation needs to do a lot more, and I welcome an opportunity to continue this conversation with you.
Yeah, I think it's very appropriate, particularly given the imported areas of where we're bringing food in. We still have a lot of good domestic production, but in a lot of areas we're using a global supply chain, and I think that heightens it, as it has on the drug side. It's equally heightened on the food side.
Thank you. Thanks for your work and your teams. Really appreciate your being here and your contribution to our nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
And I will yield to Senator Ossoff and turn the gavel over to him.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Comptroller General, nice to see you again. I want to thank you and your team for the support that you have provided to several investigations I've led over the last couple of years, in particular the research and analysis that you produced supporting the PSI bipartisan investigation into deaths in custody in state and local facilities across the country, an issue I know Senator Blumenthal's focused on as well. I led an investigation last year into the Bureau of Prisons and introduced bipartisan legislation with Senator Braun called the Federal Prisons Oversight Act to establish greater accountability and transparency within the BOP. In the newly added section of the high-risk list titled Management of the Federal Prison System, you cite a February 2021 report that you produced, which found BOP did not have reliable methods for assessing its staffing levels. Can you describe the methodology that you observe BOP using to evaluate its staffing needs, and how and why it so inadequately guides their staffing efforts?
Yes, I'm going to ask my colleague Charles Johnson, who's headed that work. But what we noticed initially that led to the conclusion, between 2017 and 2021, their use of overtime went up over 100%. And that's always an indication that you have some sort of staffing challenge. But Charles can explain the details.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, Senator. Additional to what the Comptroller General just mentioned, not only did overtime go up, it's continuing to go up, and there's been continued gaps in their staffing as well. As a matter of fact, the data we have in the report now, we've recently got updates as of yesterday or this morning, and the numbers are continuing to decline. They have a 15% gap in their authorized staffing levels. And also, based on all the work we've done in the past couple of years, we've looked at their efforts to calculate staff, and we didn't see a good methodology in place. And that's one of the recommendations we have made, and we think the new director, Peters, is committed to looking into that issue. We've had several meetings with her, including the Comptroller General has met with her. At the time we were meeting with her, she was in the process of doing strategic planning. She also is looking to establish clear goals with respect to their staffing needs, as well as other programs that they have as well.
And I think Director Peters has acknowledged multiple times the impact, the negative impact of these staffing challenges. From your perspective, Mr. Johnson, what are those impacts, the ramifications for the administration of federal prisons?
Well, some of the things we point out in our report, and that she has acknowledged, is the safety and security of the inmates, as well as her own staff. As you know, some of the death in custody work that you've looked at and championed, and some of the things we've looked at recently with respect to some of the facilities. There's been some facilities closed as a result of the lack of sufficient care and custody of some of the inmates, and Director Peters herself has been responsible for some of the closings recently.
Remaining on the subject of deaths in custody, the bipartisan investigation that I led with Senator Johnson detailed the failures of DOJ to account for deaths in custody. GAO recommended in March of this year that BOP collect and monitor participation data for unstructured activities that incarcerated people participate in to earn first step time credits.
Correct.
But BOP did not concur with this recommendation. Given that participation in these programs can mean an earlier release for offenders with good time credits, can you describe some of these programs and the difficulties BOP is having with implementation?
Yeah, part of the issue there is that there's not a clear sort of criteria for what programs count. There are some situations where inmates may be getting credit for just sitting in their cell, which should be not part of the criteria. In addition, there's inconsistency that we found at different facilities in terms of how time credits are being allotted or not giving credit for certain time credits. Even the inmates themselves don't know what they can do to get the time credits. So that's some of the things that we recommended that they addressed as well. Come up with clear guidance and criteria for how you can obtain time credits.
Did BOP communicate to you why they did not concur with your recommendation that they collect and monitor participation data?
They didn't see the need. They felt like what they had in place was clear. Obviously, we wrote in our report that we disagree, and we think it's something important that they need to do, primarily so individuals incarcerated will know what they can do to earn their time credits.
I plan to elevate this to what we consider a priority recommendation that should be implemented. So we're going to continue to push for the implementation of this recommendation. I think it's needed. Every year I write a letter to every major department in the federal government, to the head of the agency, in this case the Attorney General, and list what I think are priority open recommendations that haven't been implemented yet. This will be on the list for this report. I asked the same question, and that's not a satisfactory answer, in my opinion.
This Congress, I'm leading the Human Rights Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee alongside Senator Blackburn. As I mentioned, GAO has provided over the last couple of years very robust support and prompt responses to my requests for analysis at the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Comptroller General, will you duly and timely consider any requests for further GAO work product that I may make in order to advance investigations at the Human Rights Subcommittee?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about some DoD issues. Since 1990, when GAO first published the high-risk list, DoD weapons system acquisition has been consistently listed as a high-risk item, indicating the potential for fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And as the GAO report states, for much of this period, DoD weapons systems were, quote, consistently costing more, taking longer to develop, and performing at lower than anticipated levels. In your view, is DoD negotiating effectively when it engages in procurement to get the best value for taxpayers? How would you assess the work of ODT&E at evaluating the development of systems that DoD is procuring? And do you have any other specific recommendations for Congress whereby perhaps through the National Defense Authorization Act we could improve procurement practices of the department?
Yes. First, with regard to prices, competition is the key to getting the lowest price, as we've seen over the years. And initially, there is some competition in this area, but quickly they go down to a single contractor. Now, they do have the ability to get price information from that contractor, but also getting, and negotiating. So, but once you go down to a single contractor, you lose a lot of the value of competition. And so that's part of the problem with the weapon systems. Now, what we've also said in that area is that they move forward with going into development and production, from research into development and then into production before the technologies are mature. And so there's, simultaneous things going on, and then that leads to costly redesigns later on in the process. Now, what happens in the DoD, and particularly in the weapon systems, there's an enormous push to be on a par with our adversaries, and that there's a military need for this issue, which tends to override some of the normal practices you would use to bring down the costs and not do simultaneous production while you haven't matured fully the technology. And so that is an issue. So we've made a number of recommendations to not go into full production until you've matured the technologies and you have a better issue. I mean, we've raised that issue on the Joint Strike Fighter and other things over the years. So that's definitely an issue. So we've constantly recommended leading practices for how to manage these acquisitions over time. And we've seen some improvements in some areas, but where there's that desire to, compete with China or Russia or whatever, that sometimes the cost takes a back seat.
Where there are substantial cost overruns, the department still has substantial leverage in these relationships. How could it better exert that leverage in order to spare taxpayers the cost where either the program office has not accurately projected costs or the producer has failed to meet a budget?
Yeah. A lot depends on how they structure the contract in the first place, and whether it's, they've been trying to move in some areas to like a fixed price thing, and if things go over, then the contractor eats some of the costs versus the federal government. But if you're on a cost reimbursable contract, so we suggested they be careful in what type of contracts that they struck over time. But we have some additional recommendations. I'll provide it for the record in that area because it's a pretty complicated area.
Well, thank you for your testimony today and the service of your whole team to the legislative branch. You really empower us to more effectively execute our oversight and responsibilities. So grateful to you and your team. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days. That's until May 5th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record, and the hearing is adjourned.